Welcome to Football Unspoken, the home of unique football takes. As Josh O, I've got an interesting debate around substitutions for you today. But before we jump into that, I've got a real difficult trivia question for you. So you ready?
I'm ready.
Right. So can you tell me when the first legal substitution was made in a professional football game in England? What year? What season?
I'm going to throw out a random and say 1961.
You are so close. I'm very impressed. You are so close. It was 1965-66 season.
I'm stoked with that.
That is a ridiculously good guess. It was after a goalkeeper was injured, and it was Bolton Wanderers, I believe, who was allowed to make a substitution. But going off from that, so we've seen a number of managers complaining about fatigue, a lot of injuries happening through this season specifically, and just a general kind of annoyance around player workload coming up recently. So I have a question for you. Do you think that there's space for rolling substitutes to become the norm in football?
I hate this question. It's naughty, and you know what you're doing by asking this question. As a football purist, I'm straight away like, clearly not. That's terrible. That would totally ruin the game. On the flip side, I actually think there could be some real positives for the game as well. You could have smaller squads by doing that, which then would sort of break down the inflation that we have in the league into the transfers and wages, because you got these bigger and bigger squads you have to have, and therefore a Manchester City or whoever has to buy a squad of 25 top four level players, etc. So I can see some merits to it. I'm going to stick with my football purist guns and say I don't see any space in the professional game. It takes away from the tactical elements of the game. And the second one, now you didn't have an opportunity yet to place any restrictions on the rolling subs. That may be where you're going with it.
So that's an interesting one. So I'll firstly address that one. And I actually think it would go the opposite way, to be entirely honest. And I actually have the opposite opinion to you. I think it would speed up games. In your amateur games, where you have rolling subs, it's a very quick change a lot of the time because players are ready, they're there, there's not too much of a palaver around getting players on. So personally, I think it would actually end up speeding the games up a little bit because the substitutes aren't big an event, you know what I mean? They're not going to be this big whole thing and having to get 8 or 9 people involved in it, all these coaches and stuff. So I personally think there's an opportunity for it to speed up the game. I'm not sure what you think about that.
Yeah, so something I was pondering when you were explaining that was, I think the rolling sub thing could work with some very strict guidelines. So when I say guidelines, I'm talking about maybe you can only make substitutions maybe every 15 minutes or something like that. So 15, 30, half time, 60, 75, 90, something like that. And then you have rolling subs too. And then with that in mind, at the 15-minute mark, the next ball that goes out of play at that 15-minute interval is instantly a substitution break, and the managers utilize that. And in that case, as you say, because that break is dedicated for the substitution, the players are on and off instantly, and it would speed up the game. That I could see working. Does that, where it does improve the game, this just occurred to me now, is it keeps players not fitter as in their overall fitness, but as in they have more energy. And when the players have more energy, you get a better product as a football fan, because players with more energy are running harder, tackling more. There's less goals being scored just off the back of mistakes. And when I say mistakes, could be some lack of tracking back, or a defender who's just so exhausted he's done something lazy, either a bad tackle or just cleared a ball he shouldn't have. So I think you get less low quality goals and more high quality goals by having a more energetic team. And actually a reflection of that was last season Newcastle. Normally you would be the one bringing this up, but I'm going to bring up Newcastle on this one. Last season when Newcastle had their strategy of extreme high intensity when the ball's in play and then slow down the game, as in bring down the minutes of in play, you saw Newcastle probably being one of the, if not the most exciting team in the league last year because of that. So from that perspective, I can see football as a viewing spectacle actually having a big positive if you were to do rolling subs. And when I say rolling subs, I would want strict guidelines around it.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I mean, I would the one thing I would say is I would probably look to use the NBA as an example of where rolling subs are really successful, where it's the play doesn't stop for a rolling sub. It's there's someone on the sideline who notes down who's going on and who's going off. That takes 10 seconds, and play doesn't stop. So you have to be smart about when you're gonna make these substitutions at a goal kick and a throw in, and it has to be quick because there's no stop in play. And that's why I wouldn't put restrictions necessarily on when you can do it, but I would put the restriction in that if your player's not ready, unlucky, he's got to get on the field. He's got to get on the field. And he's got to get in the right position. That's on you.
Yeah, we got to be careful that we don't let FIFA overhear you, because I think they would run to the hills with your idea of rolling subs. Because now that I've said the piece about it would actually increase the spectacle of the sport, and your point, because I just also thought, as soon as, can you imagine during a live game, one of the, like De Bruyne comes off for Man City and Grealish comes on, the commentators would be all over that. And as a neutral watching that game, you're instantly excited. There's something happening now, suddenly at a trivial throw-in's happening in the game. But from a commentary perspective, you're like, oh, Guardiola's taking off De Bruyne. That's a big talking point. And suddenly it's just another avenue to keep a game that's maybe a boring 0-0 suddenly very engaging. It's just an extra thing to talk about, basically.
Yeah. The other thing I find interesting is the other point you made was about the tactics, the tactical side, and then taking away. And I don't necessarily. I think it would take away from the football purist tactical side of it, where it's like a bit of a chess game and that. But I think it would add an extra element in the fact that, so the example I'd have, and Kevin De Bruyne is a great one, but so you've got Man City and they're playing and they're winning 1-0, and then take De Bruyne off, take Haaland off, and in the 80th minute, they're 2-1 down. And you're like, oh, who are they going to bring on? What can they do? And you can bring on De Bruyne, you can bring De Bruyne back, you can bring Haaland back. And it's helpful for those big teams. But I start thinking about your smaller teams, your I mean, Everton fans are going to hate me for calling them a smaller team. But at the moment, Everton, where, they bring off a Dominic Calvert-Lewin. I know he didn't have a great season this season, but he's a great player. Bring up Dominic Calvert-Lewin. Give him a 10-15 minute break, and then bang, you bring him back on at the 80th minute for an extra 10 minutes, or Ivan Toney for Brentford. And it gives these smaller teams with less great players the opportunity to give their great players a 5-10 minute break, bring it back on with a little bit more energy, and see what they can do in the last 10-15.
What'd be really fascinating about it is, I think both you and I are under the assumption that if you put this in tomorrow, there would be this massive increase in substitutions throughout the match. I'm not sure, actually thinking it through realistically, there would be. And I know maybe for someone listening to this, that sounds outrageous. The only reason I say that is just thinking about, I've been watching football since the amount of substitutions in the Premier League have gone from 3 in a match all the way to now 7 in a game. And to be honest, I think it's quite rare, let's call it within reasonable time. Let's say before the 85th minute, I'm saying. It's very rare to have a team make more than 3 substitutions, excluding injuries, before the 85th minute in the Premier League. So in that way, it hasn't really changed anything. The one thing that's changed that obviously gets utilized every game is the amount of subs you can have on the bench. So the bench is always fully stacked, and therefore the managers have more options to twist and turn. That has changed over time. But I would say the amount of substitution, meaningful substitution, hasn't changed. And therefore, even with your rolling subs, I'm not sure it would be this frenzy of substitutions that I was at first envisioning when you posed the question.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. People kind of look, especially like I said, because rolling subs is amateur, like Sunday league football, isn't it? Really, that's what you think when you think rolling subs, and because that's not all over the park, not even just the substitutions. It's all a bit mental, a bit frantic. That's kind of what you think. But I sit there and I go, these guys have X amount of subs to use already, and normally they don't use them before the 50th minute anyway. And now, don't get me wrong, I think you would see more substitutions around the 47 to 50 minute mark with rolling subs. But I also don't think you want to disrupt at that level the flow of your team. You don't want to consistently be bringing on players on and off. But I think the idea, just the potential of having a player be able to come off and then go back on after a little break. For me, it's exciting. And having watched the NBA for the last couple of years, it's really cool to see how quickly they get these players on and off, how they get them situated. I understand there's a lot less players, so it makes it a bit easier. But also, you know that the game's not done if when a player goes off. If a LeBron James or Steph Curry goes off, it doesn't mean game's done, nothing's going to happen. Whereas you watch some of the more boring games where Man City start taking off their big players, and Liverpool start taking off their big players. You're like, okay, game is winding down now. I just think the added element would be really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see it now. At first, as I said, as a football purist, I wouldn't have inherently agreed with it, but I could see there's space to have a dialogue about it. I'd be willing to sit at the table now, where before I probably wasn't.
Okay, I appreciate that. I was going to ask what your kind of final thoughts were, but I appreciate the final thought being you'll have the conversation. I have a feeling there's a lot of people who's going to have your first opinion and not shift from it, and that's fair enough. If that's your opinion, definitely get in touch. Let us know if you agree with us, if you think it's something that you would like to see, and potentially could even add an extra element to the Premier League or just football in general. Let us know that as well. For the moment, that's been Football Unspoken. Have a great weekend.